So in this lesson, we're going to have a look at Who in One Lifetime by Muriel Rukeyser. I'm not quite sure how to say her surname, so drop me a message if you if you know that. So yeah, it's a nice little poem, this one, and you can kind of see it's in copyright, so I don't have the full poem here. So the first thing I'd recommend doing with this one is just pausing me, finding the poem, and just reading it aloud to yourself. You might want to have a look at some of the key vocab that's here as well on the page. So most of the vocab's reasonably simple, but there's just like the odd word that might confuse you. So I've put most of the difficult words here for you to have a look at. So yeah, pause me, read the poem, underline any kind of images or important words that stand out to you. Don't worry if you don't understand the whole thing, because like I say, it does use some difficult words, so there might be gaps in meaning as you read through, but try and get a general gist of what the poem's about. And then when you're ready, you can come back to the lesson and I'll give you a translation. So yeah, as a summary, we've got this idea that who in one lifetime, so what kind of person, what single person in just one life would see everything kind of disappear, like, all causes lost, dismayed and helpless, cities destroyed, love turned boring, fear and sad-faced unstoppable armies, sickness, in the face of all of this being still self-reflecting and whole. So how could a single person in one life endure so much kind of suffering and difficulty in society and so many personal and universal public experiences that are negative, but still remain self-reflecting and whole? Self-reflecting is where you kind of constantly look at yourself and whether you're a good person or you're doing good things or you're kind of happy. She knows how several madnesses are born, seeing the integrated never fighting well, the flesh too vulnerable, the eyes torn with tears. So there's a lot of kind of dark, devastating imagery here to do with the suffering of humanity and the kind of perils that we face in our lives. All sides who are part of the war in a state of pre-surrender. They make a treaty and are possessed by an impatience which turns their camps of ambush into chambers of imagery. She holds belief in the world. She stays and hides life in her own defeat. And she stands, though her whole world burns, a childless goddess of fertility. So it's difficult, the imagery in this poem. It can be kind of complex. But the main idea is that if everything's going, crashing and burning around you, everything's going wrong, everyone's at war, you've seen so much tragedy and difficulty in your life, if you can remain stable and in control of yourself through that difficulty and that suffering, then you're a goddess of fertility, a childless goddess of fertility, which is also a strange image, but basically you do well. That's the only way to kind of survive difficulty. So there's another poem that I teach a lot called If by Rudyard Kipling. I think it's actually my most viewed poem on YouTube. I don't know why, it just went like really big compared to my other poems. But yeah, if you are interested in these ideas or the idea of how do you navigate your way through life as a person, what type of attitude to life or philosophy on life will get you far and keep you strong in the face of difficulty, then I really recommend reading If by Rudyard Kipling. And also, if you want, you can look at my analysis of it on YouTube. So yeah, this poem reminds me a lot of If. It's got a female persona at the center of it instead of a male, but the sentiment is kind of quite similar about everything being chaotic around you and then standing firm and steadfast in the face of that yourself and maintaining integrity and strength. So it's a passionate tone, and yeah, there's this sense of kind of like terror and dread and tragedy that happens all around us, which should really cause an individual to despair. But if a woman has the strength to face this kind of flaming world, then they have their own power that, means that the chaos of life can't touch them. So it's quite important that the poet is a social activist, and you can see this as like a political poem, as a sort of inspirational, motivational poem. So you might think on first reading, oh, that's quite depressing. But actually it's intended to motivate you and make you feel like even if everything is going completely wrong around you, you can have this type of attitude that maintains your strength in the face of difficulty and oppression. So there's another poem as well that's really amazing. So there's If by Rudyard Kipling that has a similar idea. And I've forgotten it now. I thought of it a second ago and I was like, I'll remember it hopefully as we go through. I'll think about it while we're analysing this one. Oh yeah, that's it. What's he called? Invictus. I can't remember who wrote this poem. I think it's like the only poem that he wrote. This guy wrote this poem Invictus, and it has the closing lines are, I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my storm, I think, of the storm. And it's just so powerful. People draw on it over and over again. But he actually, the poet who wrote Invictus, he'd gone through the worst life. So if you read that poem, just have a look at the guy's life. It's horrific what happens to him. And it's just so inspirational that he can write that kind of poem and have that type of strong, unflinching attitude in the face of absolute chaos and destruction. So this is the difference with this poem, is that it's actually a female writer and a female persona. So it's kind of got this sort of, more feminine imagery, and it's centered perhaps more around women's plight or kind of feminist issues. But yeah, the idea of the poem here aligns very much with Kipling's If and Invictus, who I've forgotten what he's called, who wrote it. But yeah, amazing poems, both of those. So if you're really into the ideas of this or you find it quite inspirational, definitely read those two as well. So there's quite a lot of kind of clear, overt language usage here. The main thing is sort of, I think that's important with the language is this allusion. So there's a kind of historical allusion to the idea of the Great Depression, or the kind of difficult time period following the First and Second World War and the aftermath of those wars. So there's a lot of kind of turmoil, chaos, and misery that is going on in the world at the time that this poem is created. It's quite interesting. It's almost an oxymoron, childless goddess of fertility. How can you be a goddess of fertility and childless? You might want to think more deeply about that and why that's the ending of the poem. It's a little confusing. So I think generally my take on it is that it's sort of like a domestic, traditional power for women to have children. And the poet's probably suggesting that women can be, valuable members of society in other ways than having children. So you can be a goddess of fertility and produce and create other things than offspring. So perhaps the poet feels like her poetry is a form of, she has to be kind of fertile in order to produce poems or in order to contribute to society in different ways. So there's a sense that it's kind of like an anti-domestic poem. It's about like the individual power of women. So yeah, she's talking about pre-surrender as well, the idea of like, war building up to the point where war ends, ideas of pre-surrender. There's camps of ambush to chambers of imagery is another kind of interesting sticking point in the poem. So I think the idea is that you can turn difficult situations and sort of sticky scenarios into creative output. So instead of just kind of focusing on the war and the difficulty of the war, you can transform that. You can almost transfigure that into art and poetry, and it's kind of like you're changing something bad into something good. There's a repetition of sickness as well, so you might want to think about that. It's a nice picture of her. She's quite scary looking. I think she believed what she said about, women in this poem, definitely. I'm a bit scared of her, so I'm going to move away from her and go to the structure and form. So it's kind of like a sonnet. It's got 14 lines in total. So you might want to look up sonnet forms, why they're written, and why she might have chosen to kind of draw on the sonnet form. It's not a full traditional sonnet, but yeah, it does kind of seem to have echoes of a sonnet, which is a love poem form. So you might want to think about why is she doing that in a bit more detail. There's also free verse, so there's this kind of more modernist kind of style where there's no set structure to the lines. There's no set rhythm or meter or rhyme. There's also third person singular, which is very important. So she, who is the she in the poem? Why does she use, the poet use the word she instead of, naming the person or speaking from a bit more of a personal perspective? It creates a kind of archetype woman that is the subject of the poem, hypothetically any woman in any situation. So I'm trying to avoid her face because she's scary. Oh, there we go. I'm going to just go a little bit to context. We can look a little bit more into her. So yeah, she is well known for feminist poetry. You can see this as a feminist poem. Women, war, children, the future, these are key themes, and you can see those with this kind of central metaphor of war being really prevalent, not only in her poetry in general, but specifically in this poem, Who in One Lifetime. There's a central metaphor of war. So she was one of the very unlucky people who born in 1913, so just before World War One. She wouldn't have remembered World War One, but she did live through it. Then she'd have remembered and experienced World War Two, and then she'd have experienced other kind of subsequent wars that happened throughout the mid 1900s. The Cold War being, something that starts in the 70s going into the 80s. Also like the tension between capitalism and communism and, Vietnam and all that type of thing as well. So yeah, she felt like her life was held between wars. So war just kind of frames her existence, and she's constantly having to find her own identity and her own kind of reasons for living in the face of all of that. So it's a kind of socio-political conflict that's going on, which is this wider political climate, and then this personal struggle that an individual has, especially a woman has, within that context. So it's a very abstract poem talking about kind of wider ideas of society. You can look at some key sort of opinions here. So yeah, there's this idea that we keep going in the face of adversity. You just keep kind of moving forwards, and if you do that, you end up strong. I would agree with this, not necessarily just for women, generally for all individuals. If you kind of keep powering on against whatever chaos happens to you, you end up somewhere at least eventually. This idea that hope springs eternal as well. There's this belief, this constant belief and constant hope that the world can be better, which is quite inspirational in the poem. There's also this really interesting dichotomy or tension between order and chaos, or destruction and creation, or free will and determinism. It's kind of framed in different ways. So free will and determinism is like a philosophical way of looking at it, where either you just, life happens to you and whatever chaos happens, you have to accept it, or you have willpower to fight against that, and you have your own kind of personal power that battles against and engages with the world. So she's very much of the free will side of that debate. She's not deterministic. In terms of order and chaos, there's a feeling like the world is chaotic, and she is ordered, and she keeps herself in check despite all of it, and makes positives out of negatives constantly. And then in terms of destruction and creation, there's a sense that there is a creative potential in destruction. So again, that idea of like, chambers of imagery coming out of camps of ambush, or hiding life in her own defeat. You can see these juxtapositions show that you can actually twist a negative situation round to a positive, and you can emerge victorious from destruction. It's a very powerful and quite compelling message, I think, there in the poem. Yeah, so there's some tasks here, and you can look at the themes a little bit more deeply if you like, and then when you're ready, you can try these essay questions too. If you need any more poetry analyses, or you want to download these documents, you can also go to scribbly.com. So yeah, thank you very much for listening, and hopefully you like this poem, and read If and Invictus if you have time as well. And hopefully I'll see you guys soon.